What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Silent Night, starring Joel Kinnaman and directed by Hong Kong action legend John Woo, a director that I was totally obsessed with back in the 90s, but it's been a minute since he's directed a movie for Hollywood. It's been about 20 years since Paycheck, a movie which I never saw. Actually, the last John Woo movie that I saw in the theater was Mission Impossible 2 in the summer of 2000. And what was crazy about that movie, like in the late 80s and early 90s, John Woo was making like one masterpiece after another in Hong Kong. Movies like The Killer and Hard Boiled. A Better Tomorrow 2. I mean, those action movies were changing the action genre seemingly overnight with just like the ballet, the beautiful ballet of death and violence that those movies provided, but also just like crazy emotion, incredibly stylish filmmaking. He was the shit. And then he got recruited to Hollywood, and he made Hard Target, and he made Broken Arrow, and then suddenly with Face Off and then with Mission Impossible 2, he just exploded. Mission Impossible 2 was the most popular movie in America the summer of 2000. Actually, the entire year of 2000. It was the highest grossing movie of that year. And I just thought it was so cool that like the John Woo experiment of bringing John Woo over to Hollywood and putting him to work, it worked. And he had many imitators who were not as talented, and there were many people that were trying to like rip off the Hong Kong style at that time, because throughout the 1980s, Hong Kong was experiencing a true golden age of action cinema. Whether you're talking about Jet Li films, Jackie Chan films, Sammo Hung, doesn't matter. There was a hell of a lot of good action being made in Hong Kong at that time. And I would say the great majority of the attempts to kind of imitate that style, it always felt a little watered down or a little diluted. You'd have actors who like weren't quite quick enough or dexterous enough or just well trained enough to perform the action. But obviously a few exceptions would be something like The Matrix, where Yuen Woo-ping, who was both the director as well as the choreographer, came onto that flick and added a little extra something special to make that sci-fi movie that much better. But you could make a case that John Woo is the most successful import in terms of filmmakers. I'm not talking about stars like Jet Li and Jackie Chan, but as a director, goddamn, he really made his mark in Hollywood in a very short period of time, working with action stars like Jean-Claude Van Damme, or obviously Nicolas Cage and John Travolta and Tom Cruise. I mean, it was crazy. Overnight, he'd just kind of taken over. But I haven't watched a movie by John Woo or a new movie by John Woo in a very, very long time. I don't know why. I haven't watched any of the movies that he's made in the 21st century. And judging by the level of action on display in Silent Night, I've probably been doing myself a disservice. And I'm not going to say that Silent Night is the equal of his great classics from the past. That would be totally absurd. But if you like ruthless vigilante revenge stories with a lot of brutality and just a lot of kick-ass action sequences and a very interesting kind of gimmick at the core of the story, because Silent Night, obviously, it's a Christmas-themed action movie, but the lead character, he's unable to talk due to being shot in the throat. But as a result, they apply that same limitation to the entire cast and crew. It's not a silent movie because you have gunshots and music, and you've got people talking on the radio in the background or sending text messages. So it's not a purely silent movie. But this might be the most successful attempt at using kind of silent film storytelling techniques going all the way back to like the 1920s, when that was the only style that filmmakers could employ. And of course, some people hung on to it a little longer. Charlie Chaplin was still making silent movies in the 1930s. But it's basically been like a dead art form for about a century. But John Woo brought it back, and I think on the whole, I'd say the experiment or the gimmick worked. Because early on in the movie, when Joel Kinnaman's character was going through a rehab, I kept expecting the doctors to say, oh, it's going to be a long, slow, painful process learning to speak and swallow again, or it's going to be a long, slow, painful process learning to move again, etc. and so forth. But nobody was saying anything. I thought he was going to be the only character in the movie that never spoke, but it's the entire cast. I was like, okay, let's just roll with it. And then I completely stopped noticing, and I just got sucked up into this maelstrom of just, murder and revenge and just violence. What it reminded me of was basically like a Punisher origin story, but without like the costume and without any of the military training in Vietnam. Because this character, he's just a good old-fashioned kind of dad. He's a family man, and he and his wife and his kid are playing in the front yard. And then two vehicles drive by, engaged in a massive shootout. Their child catches a stray bullet. Joel Kinnaman tries to chase them down. They fuck him up. They shoot him in the throat. And then the rest of the movie is basically like a half-hour training sequence followed by just one grisly, bloody action scene after another. And I could tell that my crowd was into it because anytime there was something particularly gruesome or particularly violent, a lot of the rowdy people in my crowd would be like, oh shit, like you could hear them exclaiming in kind of horror, because this is a hard R action movie that's holding back nothing when it comes to just gruesome gore and violence. And as I was taking a few notes before recording this video, I found this quote by John Woo where he was interviewed about the movie, where he said, "Very interesting movie. The whole movie is without dialogue. It allowed me to use visuals to tell the story, to tell how the character feels. We are using music instead of language, and the movie's all about sight and sound. The budget was a little tight and the schedule was tight, but it made me change my working style. Usually for a big movie, a studio movie, we shoot a lot of coverage, then leave it in the cutting room, but in this movie I tried to combine things without doing any coverage shots. I had to force myself to use a new kind of technique. Some scenes were about 2 or 3 pages, but I did it all in one shot." And what's incredible is how John Woo not only still has it when it comes to choreographing and orchestrating, huge battle sequences, but that he still has the desire. He's in his late 70s at this point. He's been working a long time, and I'm sure he's got a decent amount of money tucked away, but maybe he's just one of those guys like Ridley Scott or like Clint Eastwood or Paul Verhoeven, where no matter how old they get, they feel most at home on a movie set surrounded by stunt people and technicians and really cool actors. And going into this, my only real kind of curveball or X factor that I was worried about was whether or not Joel Kinnaman could carry a movie all on his own, because I really liked him in season 1 of Altered Carbon, and I particularly enjoyed him in The Suicide Squad by James Gunn, where I thought he was one of the best ingredients in this incredible ensemble cast that included Idris Elba and Margot Robbie and John Cena and all these other really dynamic performers and really popular stars. But I thought maybe the best scene in that whole movie is when he and Peacemaker fight to the death. And Joel Kinnaman, he's emerging as a full-blown badass action star. And I was so skeptical in the early days when they did that PG-13 remake of RoboCop. I was like, first of all, anybody making a PG-13 remake of RoboCop should be put to death for even attempting to make a PG-13 remake of RoboCop. But that, obviously he was a young actor. He wanted to get the gig. He wanted to get the work. But here we are many years later, and he's still at it. And I have to say, he's absolutely growing on me, and I think he's a total fucking stud. And maybe just due to my age, I'm just a sucker for a big training sequence or a big rehab sequence. One of my favorite rehab sequences from back in the day was when Steven Seagal in Hard to Kill, like in the first scene of the movie, he gets shot, he goes into a coma, wakes up in the hospital, his muscles are all atrophied, and he's got to fight his way out of the hospital while people are trying to kill him. And then he goes through this process of healing his body and getting strong and powerful again. And as a little kid, I just absolutely ate that up, watching him just doing everything in his power to become a stud again. But I guess maybe it's considered a little formulaic or a little cheesy, but people don't really do those rehab sequences or training sequences. But what I liked about this is that he has the same motivation as a vigilante like Batman, but he never tries to become a superhero because he's not quite good enough to be a superhero. He's just a regular guy who gets real strong, starts practicing with guns, going to the shooting range, starts practicing with knives on dummies and learning how to, be a stunt driver and that sort of thing. But in the end, he's still just a normal guy. And in his first outing as a vigilante, he gets his ass kicked. He's got a guy totally, literally on the ropes, hanging from a ceiling, and yet manages to get stabbed multiple times. And he gets fucked up. And I enjoy watching a brutal action movie where the hero's not totally invulnerable or impervious to harm. And it's cool seeing a movie where the form of the movie very much follows the function. If we're trying to get inside the head of somebody who's been robbed of the ability to speak, but is consumed with the desire for revenge, I think it's interesting that the movie deprives us of dialogue, just to kind of help put us in the same headspace as the central character. And once the violence starts, man, it was fucking relentless. And Lionsgate obviously has made a lot of money recently producing the John Wick movies, but this is not going for the John Wick flavor at all. It's just, there's none of that kind of slick motion. It's much more just about force and strength. Even a lot of the villains, it's a lot of hack and slash and a lot of shotguns that are point blank. There's one really long camera movement toward the end of the movie. I was like, all right, we're almost kind of getting into John Wick territory, because as Kinnaman's raiding this headquarters of this base, he's going up this really long stairwell and he's battling people along the way. But you could just as easily make comparisons to something like The Raid. And there are a lot of movies that have employed long shots like that. And there are one or two brief little moments that almost feel like John Woo's kind of winking at the audience, where he reminds you of the director that he used to be back in the late 80s and early 90s. It's a character played by Scott Mescudi, Detective Dennis Vassell. And he's basically a detective who's taken an interest in the central character, and he's kind of watching from a distance while the vigilante periodically feeds him information. He's basically like Commissioner Gordon to Batman in the context of this movie. But when he shows up for the final kind of final showdown, when he starts, whipping out his guns and fucking people up, for a brief shining moment, it's like Chow Yun-fat. It's back in his physical prime, double fisting the guns and that sort of thing, like all the little trademark little details that we all associate with John Woo. But what I loved early on is when Joel Kinnaman's at the shooting range, he's not just like pop, pop, pop shooting. He's doing like moves and choreography where he's like passing his gun back and forth and shooting left-handed and right-handed. You can tell he's like practicing his moves to be in a John Woo movie. And then, of course, we get to see the final product when he goes on a murderous rampage. But the sad reality is that lightning very rarely strikes in the same place. And I would say that the best action scenes of John Woo's career are about 30 years in the rearview mirror. When you watch the best scenes from Hard Boiled, you're just like, oh my God, like, how has this art form been lost? Like this art form that was so like perfect and pure in its intentions and so uncompromised in its vision. Like, where has that style of action gone? And someone very rightly argues, hey, well, then watch The Night Comes For Us. Watch The Raid 2. Like, there are some really cool action scenes there. But there's something just like kind of gritty and old-fashioned, like quintessentially like that you associate with the action genre, or maybe just because I was at such a young, impressionable age when I was seeing these movies. When I was in college, when I first saw The Killer, I kept hearing about it like in the context of like Quentin Tarantino interviews and references and that sort of thing. So I had this VHS box set which had The Killer and Hard Boiled letterbox, and this is still at a time where letterbox movies were the exception as opposed to the norm. It's before even DVDs. And my friends and I, we just wore those tapes out. We would get blazing high and watch just the ballet of violence, and it was pretty goddamn cool. And then eventually, when I moved to LA, I got to see The Killer and Hard Boiled in the theater at the New Bev, and holy shit, my life was never the same. So I guess the $1 million question is, or the $20 question is, should people rush out and see this flick in the theater during the holiday season at a time where everybody's got bills to pay and presents to buy and flights to reserve and all that crap? Like everybody's expenses fly through the roof this time of year. So every $20-25 you spend on the movies, you will feel the pinch. I would say that if you are a longtime John Woo fan, or you're just rooting hard for Joel Kinnaman and his action career, absolutely go see it. But there's a lot of competition out there right now, and there's going to be more on its way, like The Boy and the Heron by Hayao Miyazaki, or Godzilla -1. Like, there's some other cool movies out there which I might recommend that people see first. It's interesting seeing an old school Japanese director and an old school Hong Kong director both having movies in the theater at the same time, all while Godzilla -1 is playing in the theater. For whatever reason, right now we're getting a lot of Asian cinema, or at least movies created by Asian filmmakers in America all at once, and I'm all for it. They're all badass directors. But if you're a young movie fan and you're like, who the hell is John Woo, and what the fuck is this bald-headed idiot even talking about? Here would be my recommendation. Rent The Killer from 1989. Rent Hard Boiled. Rent A Better Tomorrow Part 1 and 2. And he's got a couple other ones that I like as well, but those are the four that I always keep coming back to just because the action is so spectacular. I think The Killer is a better movie. Hard Boiled is a better action movie, but you kind of can't go wrong with either. But I'd say watch those first, and if you love those, then watch Hard Target and Face Off and Mission Impossible 2. I'm embarrassed to admit I never saw Broken Arrow, and I have friends that really liked it when it came out, and they didn't even know who the hell John Woo was. So that's one of my blind spots. I need to go back and see it. But if you see those movies and you're like, God damn, John Woo is the shit. He's still making movies. He's got a Hollywood movie out in the theater right now. Then I would recommend people go see it. But I think that would be a better use of your time and money, unless you just love going to the movies and getting a big group and just watching gruesome violence and mayhem unfold. But I cannot give this movie a full-throated recommendation to the degree that I would like. And I've been criticized recently on this channel with some comments, people saying, oh, this guy, he likes every movie that he sees. But here's the reality. I don't review a lot of the movies that I see that I hate, or I just don't go at all. Like I don't try to see everything, because I feel like if you try to see everything, that's a great way to fall out of love with movies, because there's so much diarrhea out there. I don't want to waste my time or my money subjecting myself or people on this channel to conversations about really shitty movies. So I try to find the good stuff and tell people about it. So here is a, I wouldn't say like, a negative review, but it's a positive review with a lot of caveats. My two main critiques would be that the villain loses all personality by the end of the movie. Like early on, he's so badass and so hardcore, but by the end, I was like, all the cool people have already been killed. I guess we just got to wrap this up and draw this movie to a close. And my other complaint would be that perhaps the movie takes a little too long to kind of get up and running. It's not a particularly long movie, but after Joel Kinnaman first gets hurt and he's like, surrendering to despair and missing his child and that sort of thing, we kind of get the point after a while. And maybe the movie could have used a little bit more of kind of the John Woo cheese or melodrama. He was notorious for doing things like having doves flying through action scenes and things like that back in the day. And there's a little bit of that in here. Like at one point in the middle of an action scene, Joel Kinnaman looks up at an ornament and just sees this child's face like, kind of glowing in the ornament. I was like, all right, that is the John Woo cheese that I know and love from back in the day. Or another example would be the kid wearing headphones listening to music while a giant battle scene unfolds during Face Off. And I remember at the time people were just like cackling wildly with laughter in the theater, like, what the fuck is going on? But not a lot of people have been exposed to John Woo prior to his arrival in America, where he kind of took the world by storm. So I would say this is a very solid action movie. It's a very good action movie. Not a great action movie, but I think if you're sick to death of PG-13 family-friendly bullshit or overpriced blockbusters that never deliver on the promise and the prestige of whatever franchise they might be trying to update for modern audiences or all that crap. Like if you just are vomiting out of every orifice in your body right now at the state of blockbuster cinema, then Silent Night would be an excellent kind of palate cleanser or a great bit of counter-programming if you're looking for a change of pace. And at a minimum, at least I got to talk about John Woo on this channel. Back in the 1990s, I didn't even know what the hell the internet was or what YouTube would ever be. Like I never in a million years dreamed that I had a platform where I could just rant and rave about whatever movies I felt like talking about. And so this is my first time talking about John Woo on the channel. And so I'm always happy to bang the drum on behalf of filmmakers that I like. And also, if you like these kind of revenge vigilante thrillers, the 70s had a lot of them, and a lot of them were like really hardcore. And there's definitely, there's levels to this genre. And everybody's going to say Death Wish, but I'm going to encourage people to check out Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder from the late 70s.
Can't just let it slide, Major. They don't have any right to live.
There's a storm brewing in this man. They took his arm. They took his family and his soul. His anger is building, and it's going to explode.
One of the most ruthless of these kind of vigilante revenge thrillers, and it just goes to really strange, unusual, dark places, and gets a very strong, full-throated recommendation by me. If you're looking for, what is the A-plus revenge saga of the 70s, definitely check out Rolling Thunder. This is nowhere near on that level, but it'll do until another good revenge saga comes our way. But I think that's all I've got to say about Silent Night. Thank you for listening to my rant. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a great weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.